Hey everyone, we've decided to do something different for this episode. Not episode actually, but a series. There's so much insights over here that we had to make it into a series with Sam Spurlin, who's one of the foremost DAO organizational design thinkers out there. In the part one of this series, we talk about his background, how the Ready functions as a self-organizing community. We also get into how meetings in general suck across organizations and how to orient it for a better action oriented meeting. And we also get into the broad conversations around essential intent and mission that DAOs could find useful to streamline their ops. Welcome everybody to the Cleat Podcast, your show for DAO insights and deep dives. My name is Abhishek Ajit, and along with me is my co-host Abhishek Sanavne. What's up, Abhi? How are you?
Hey man, doing good. Ready and pumped for this one. The brief was super interesting and really looking forward to this conversation. Let's get this started.
Absolutely. So, you, the listeners, have always enjoyed getting into the deep dives of all these operational insights. And when we had Disruption Joe come over to the episode, he happened to highlight one of the key reasons for Gitcoin really sharpening up its community was workshops that were done by this particular guest that we have on the show today. That was really insightful in just ramping up how the community was focused and really cleared up a lot of its focus. And the more I read up on the individual after that, because it's really peaked, wow, okay, who is this guy? And I want to know more about him. And then the more I read about what he and his org is up to, and thought, okay, fine, I must have him on the show. Funny story is, I had been thinking of getting him on the show for quite a long time. And then he happened to make it a serendipitous entry by posting it on his tweet, where he had asked for that sort of, so he had just kind of made it a serendipitous entry by making it a tweet where he wanted podcasts to be able to hone the set. And I thought, okay, fine, this is the moment to get into it. And now we have Sam Spurlin right here with us. Sam Spurlin is a partner over at the Ready, practically employee number one, has some of the best insights on dog design that I've seen, and the Gitcoin folk just love the guy. Wherever I privately chat with him, they really credit him a lot for sharpening the focus over there. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. I really appreciate it.
Oh, that's glad, man. And how's everything going over at your side of town?
Loving the work that I do every day. We're shifting into the cooler part of the year over here in the eastern part of the U.S., which I'm happy about. So yeah, no complaints on my end.
I think we've already hit the cooler side of town in this side of the city. I think that will change in a month because we have ETH India coming over. I think a good chunk of the crypto space will come over, so things are going to get really heated in this side of town. But weather-wise, it's going to be pretty cold here.
Nice.
Yeah. So for our listeners, what we and Sam are going to do is something that's kind of away from what we generally do about org design. And so get ready for this one. This is something we're excited for. So let's start on a slower pace, Sam. What is your story? How did you get involved in org design, and how did you find your ways to DAOs?
Yeah, so I originally went to school to be a teacher. I got my undergrad degree and I taught high school for a couple of years. But for various reasons, some of which are org design related, I came to realize later on, I was really unhappy as a teacher. So I decided to go back to graduate school for positive psychology, and specifically positive organizational psychology. And positive psychology is basically just the study of kind of everything, all the good parts of human psychology: happiness, flow, things, engagement at work, meaning, that sort of thing. And kind of realized that one of the authors of a book that was really foundational for me, a book called Flow, which I'm sure many of your readers are familiar with, written by Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He had a graduate program out in California. So kind of on a whim, I applied and went out there and did a master's degree for a couple of years. And in the process of that master's degree, which I eventually transitioned into the PhD program, I was studying specifically independent work. So solopreneurs, indie workers of all different types and flavors. And through that, I became aware of things like sociocracy and holacracy and these kind of different and more participatory organizational structures and theories, which was really fascinating. And I just kind of became obsessed with the companies who are working in that way and the organizations who are helping them. And through that, I found kind of the precursor to the Ready, which then became the Ready, and have been helping build this company as employee number one back in 2015. And what the Ready is an organizational, well, we're a future of work consultancy. So we traditionally, up until the past year or so, have worked almost exclusively with often very large, often quite old organizations who are really feeling the problems of bureaucracy, the problems of organizational debt, and sense that there may be a better way to do things, but need the help kind of getting there. So that's what the Ready does. We partner with these organizations, and really not from a high level in the sense of just like making PowerPoint decks and then kind of fading into the night, but actually partnering as coaches, team coaches, working with senior leadership teams, really trying to be on the ground and help these organizations actually practice and embody some of these new ways of working. And in the past year, we decided that we should really figure out what's happening in the DAO world, because it was impossible, roughly a year ago, to be in the kind of progressive organization, future of work space and not hear about DAOs. So I led an effort along with my colleague, Tanisi, to basically just go learn and participate as much as we can. We were kind of holding a light hypothesis that the stuff that we are good at, even though we've been doing it with more traditional organizations for the past 7 years, it may actually be helpful for DAOs as well. And I think we've pretty much confirmed that hypothesis and have been in this space ever since, as you mentioned, working with Gitcoin and others, which I'm sure we'll dive into more detail. But that's the kind of high level story of how I got involved in all of this.
I mean, that's pretty interesting. I had taken a look at the Ready also. You guys have done some pretty neat work with organizations like the Fed, and coming to the DAOs, that's like a big 180.
Both ends of the continuum, right?
Yeah.
I wish I had worked on that project, because I feel like that would have been very interesting experience to compare to like going into DAOs. But I've worked at some pretty bureaucratic organizations as well. So
yeah. So I mean, that's a crazy story right there. You have these massive MNCs or whatever just come in, and they tend to scale up a lot, or because their their essential intents within these departments are not fully fleshed out well enough, so they tend to get in a lot of people, and as you mentioned, the organizational debt just kind of becomes impossible to deal with, and then you come in to just kind of just orient them towards effective vision and make things more leaner within that. So what was your first impressions when you first saw the whole concept of DAOs? A lot of the people that tend to see the DAOs, I mean, especially you, because you've worked so closely with the trad world, seeing what's going on with these communities online, that craziness of the Web3 world, what was your impressions like? And because the way I see it, a lot of the trad world, they take some time to adjust. They maybe dismiss it initially, like I did for quite some time before I kind of gotten accustomed to the whole world of DAOs in specific. How was your impressions like, and what was your mindset around how DAOs could change the game?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two different first impressions to talk through here. So one is just prior to even really getting engaged with any DAOs, but just it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the technical aspects of DAOs and crypto and blockchains. So I think very early on, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. And I think I was definitely feeling some of that, like how much I don't come from a technical background. I'm not an engineer. I'm a tech hobbyist at best. So there was this initial thought of like, there's no way I will learn enough about these foundational technologies to be able to like even participate, which that is obviously like, you don't need to be a blockchain expert to like contribute to DAOs. So like working through that first impression was one thing. And then the second one was like the first time that you actually interact with a DAO, like you join a community call or you join some other call, you actually get into a Discord and see what's going on there. And I don't know if this is surprising or not, but I don't even remember what DAO it was. Early on, I was just like joining as many Discords as I could just to try to get the lay of the land a little bit. And I joined a bunch of calls. And the main thing that I remember thinking as I was sitting on this call was, wow, this actually feels a lot like any other sort of client organization that I've ever sat in on. Like, this is not a particularly well-structured meeting. I'm not really sure what the goal of this meeting is, and I'm not sure anybody else on this call really understands what the goal is either. And I have like 5 different things that if I had a relationship with the leader of that call, that I would offer as like things to think about to like make this go a little bit better. So that was actually quite reassuring because I felt in my element. Like, this is just a group of humans trying to come together to work on something pretty complex. And whether that's a DAO or a legacy organization, they have similar components that they're wrestling with. So those were the kind of 2 first impressions.
Oh, that's nice. I mean, DAOs in general, especially I think since you joined last year, we are only starting to get organized in specific. I mean, a lot of DAOs don't even have proper documentation for new members to come in and see what's going on, And the way onboarding kind of works, also the way you mentioned, most of them don't tend to have that sort of thing. But then a lot of DAOs have kind of improved with time, especially
Totally.
Gitcoin and a lot of the large DAOs in specific also have put in a lot of processes to ensure that the A to Z, from onboarding till being a contributor or being part of that broader product lifecycle itself, you have a lot of efficient processes, and that we'll get into later. But then stepping back for a second, because I want to understand more of the world of your trad world, the sort of work that you've done with the traditional organizations, just to understand a reference point, how we could learn from these organizations before we step into your experience with the DAO world. How exactly would trad organizations approach this concept of organizational design, and what were the sort of problems they face that you see kind of an issue that you would have to step in and kind of sort out?
Yeah. So lots of different issues. We actually we developed years ago this product called tension cards, which are just an index, a deck of index cards, 75 or so, which just each one has a statement on it that describes an organizational tension that we have seen in previous client engagements. So they are things like too many meetings, too much email, unclear who can make what sorts of decisions, 75 things like that. So that is just kind of a landscape of potential tension that we could see in any organization. And one of the interesting things I've noticed working with DAOs is that even though we made these deck of tensions years ago, like I think in 2017, before any of us were thinking about DAOs at all, a large majority of these tension cards are completely relevant to DAOs as well. And I think, again, it just comes back to that idea that we're really wrestling with the complexity of humans coming together to work on difficult problems, and the specific structures matter a little bit less. Obviously, there are some tension cards that are unrelated to what DAOs have going on, because DAOs are a different sort of structure. But our work with a traditional organization is really trying to meet them where they are. So let's really understand in your organizational operating system, which is kind of the key metaphor that we use, can we understand where there are tensions? And I don't mean interpersonal tension, which is often how we think of the word tension. It's not that these two people don't get along, although that may be true, but there are tensions that exist in terms of how we do meetings, or our structure, or our authority, or membership. We have a tool called the OS Can, has these 12 different fields where there are principles, there are practices, and there are inevitably tensions about how we are doing these things. So with a traditional organization, it's about, let's try to map our current operating system, because for most cases, they've never really, they haven't had the vocabulary or the framework to really pull apart the black box that is culture or the organization itself. So we can start to be a little bit more granular. And when you start to be more granular about what is going on in our system, you start to see a lot more levers that we can possibly pull, that we can possibly change. So a traditional kind of engagement is, let's understand the operating system. Let's figure out kind of where it hurts the most. And then let's start this participatory change process of experimenting with new practices that will help solve these tensions. So a really simple one that often we start with is that, to the surprise of no one, many organizations don't have great meeting cultures. So we'll come in, there will be a weekly staff meeting that is completely leader led. It's basically a status meeting where everybody's like going around the table and telling the leader what has changed on projects. And we would argue like that's not a particularly great use of everybody's time. I mean, at the very least, status is probably better saved in software where we can just go pull it whenever we need, as opposed to needing to get everybody together, often very senior folks, very expensive folks in this organization, just to do a round of status updates. So what would a different sort of weekly meeting look like? And we have this practice called the action meeting, which we've adopted from Holacracy and some other places and put our own spin on it, which is really about shifting that meeting to being a team-held meeting, not a leader-led meeting, where we do the bare minimum status updates to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we spend the majority of that time building an agenda together, what we call an emergent agenda, and then working our way through that agenda and getting everybody what they need so that they can leave that meeting feeling like they have everything they need completely unblocked to try to do great work for the next week. And that's a very different type of meeting. It's tightly facilitated. It has a very specific structure. And until you learn it, it feels really uncomfortable. But inevitably, it is more satisfying for everybody, and including the leader, to actually adopt this new way of working. Will help a team kind of get comfortable doing that. Will facilitate the first 5 or 6 of them, and then they've got it on their own. So that's just like a very specific, small example of helping to shift the culture around meetings. And the cool thing about action meetings, and I've literally done an hour-plus podcast on our podcast about action meetings, is that it's actually a Trojan horse for talking about much more important things in the operating system. You can't do an action meeting for very long before you start to have important conversations about authority and how we distribute it, about workflow and what it means to work in public or have transparent workflows, things like that, which will get into deeper parts of the operating system when what it seems like we're doing is just fixing a weekly action or a weekly staff meeting.
As I mentioned, the whole meeting itself is like a lever within the culture itself. How you organize a meeting and the efficacy of that meeting will go a long way in the day-to-day operations. Otherwise, it's just another wasted half an hour or 45 minutes. It just brings down the broader morale of people just coming into the whole thing. Plus,
well, totally. If you think about, in many organizations, meetings are something that we do like hundreds of times. And are we actually approaching each one of those as a rep where we're getting better? Like, is each time that we meet an opportunity to get a little bit more cohesive, to get a little bit, to build a little bit more trust, to work together a little bit better? Or do we just kind of show up and go through the motions and then, go on to our next meeting? In a lot of organizations, it's the latter. But I think there's incredible potential if you bring even just a little bit of deliberate focus and deliberate effort to the how of things like meetings, where you're actually getting better as an organization every time we meet. And we do a lot of meetings, so there's a lot of opportunity to get better.
Yeah. So could you just mention some of the organizations with which you've achieved that sort of the best meeting aspect? I mean, with your clients, if you're free to talk about it, I mean, what were the results that they achieved by having that sort of best case meeting since that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like I said, it's one of those things that is often a relatively easy place to start with an organization because there's lots of opportunities to practice. It's generally you can do it in a low impact way. So literally basically any client that you see, any logo that you see on our website, we've probably introduced action meetings to that. So like they've done it, but the interesting thing, I think, is that we really think about action meetings as just one part of a default operating rhythm. So yeah, having a really tight, good weekly meeting can be a useful thing for folks, but also in isolation, you're not getting the whole value out of it. So like the other parts of the default operating rhythm has been, a roughly monthly retrospective with a team, where we're just pausing, taking 60, 90 minutes to ask ourselves, like, what's going on? How are we doing? What's going well? What's not going as well? What might we want to change in this next kind of month and a half? And then a quarterly strategy meeting where the first go around, it's more intense because we're making sure we have a clear purpose. We're making sure we have what we call essential intent, which is that medium term, more than a year, but less than 100 years, sort of more like 3 to 5 year, most articulations of our most important work, maybe setting some prioritization even over statements. So we're going to prioritize X even over Y, those sorts of things. But we get teams doing that quarterly, which is more frequently than most of them have rarely ever done it, to make sure that we are incorporating what we're learning along the way and not just setting like a yearly goal or something even larger maybe and kind of forgetting it. Because I think it's not a hard case to make that the world changes faster than that. And it's not necessarily that we're recapitulating our strategy every quarter, but we are checking in on it and seeing if there's any tweaks to be made on our essential intent. What sort of quarterly outcomes might we want to create to pursue those essential intent? And then the last part, which we've been really experimenting with because we've spun out a software company that does this, is the idea of a governance meeting. So do we have a venue where we are considering and making changes to the agreements that govern how we are working together? So agreements agreements are literally anything. And before we started Murmur, it was an actual meeting where we would use something called integrative decision making, which is a process for coming to a consent around some sort of proposal. So we would do that monthly or every kind of month and a half. Now that we are the biggest customer of Murmur, which is a software tool for helping teams come to consent-based decisions around their agreements, it's kind of just always happening now. We're always, every couple of days, there's a new proposal for me to weigh in on in Murmur, and we're constantly evolving our agreements that way. So we've kind of removed the governance meeting as a part of the default operating rhythm.
So the way I see it, you bring in these intents for when people come together. You have the governance meetings, you have the broader action meetings as well. And all of that come under a broader essential intent that drives how each department, the broader organization itself works. Now, the way I see it, you have them. That's like a community operational system. That's what's going on mentally. But then, if you take a look at the broader organization itself, how people are organized within that organization in terms of the departments, in terms of authority, in terms of the cycles in which they operate, how important is that in the larger scheme of ensuring that essential intent is actually met and there is efficacy in how that whole organization functions,
everything affects everything else. So, essential intent, purpose. So in our OS canvas, if you can visualize kind of a grid of 12 fields, in the top left is purpose, which is all about like how do we create and use purpose as a useful artifact within our organization, and that's where essential intent type stuff will live. But it doesn't live there in isolation. So just below purpose is authority, and just below authority is structure. And I don't mean below in terms of importance, but just where it's situated on our tool. So, authority, how we share authority, how we decide who has what authority, it has a huge ramification on kind of how we function as an organization. And then the structure one, which you were starting to allude to, I think, that is an important space. Absolutely. Like the way we are structured impacts everything. The kind of interesting thing about kind of where the ready came from is that in a lot of traditional organizations, structure remains for a lot of organizations kind of the only lever that senior leaders seem to think they have. So things aren't going well in the organization. They're feeling, in our nomenclature, they're feeling tensions all over the place. But because they don't necessarily have this framework of an operating system, the only thing they can really see is the structure. and like, all right, so now it's time for the reorg. And anybody who's ever worked in a large organization, when I say reorg, it probably sends chills down your spine, because we all know that reorgs almost never actually have the effect that those senior leaders think they're going to have. And in fact, they usually create so much churn in the organization that we actually end up in a worse place than we were before. So the ready really emerged from the question about, are there other things that we can help senior leaders and just organizations in general? Are there other things other than the reorg? Because it's so disruptive. So I just say all of that to give some color around the idea that we often will do structure work with organizations, but very rarely is it the first place that we go. Because a lot of times stuff that we think is a structure tension is actually about not having clear authority, clear decision rights, or it's about really unclear kind of membership criteria and what does it actually mean to be a member of an organization. And doing work in those fields is often less disruptive than blowing up structure, which can have big ramifications.
Pretty neat. You mentioned that the reason for reorgs, I mean, these senior leadership come and they propose a reorg, and the organization tends to be in a worse place. And you kind of mentioned that the Ready does something where, okay, instead of going for such a disruptive thing, it's like a massive paradigm shift in how the organization would do it. Why not try out other things that could be far more effective and doesn't leave your employees in a worse shape? My question is, how do they come to that point where they feel that, yes, we have to go for a reorg? What are the sort of tensions that they see that makes them think, okay, it's time for a reorg? And how do you decide? Because see, a reorg is a paradigm shift, but you mentioned that it's effective. But how do you start thinking as a senior leader that, yes, it is time for a reorg? And what are the factors that make you think that, yes, we have to go for a reorg or not?
I mean, the cynical answer that I have is that it seems like any tension that senior leaders are feeling, they immediately jump to reorg as the answer. I mean, I think maybe a more generous explanation would be things like, they're sensing it's really difficult to make decisions in an organization, or it's really difficult to go from ideation to completed product in the organization because there's too many handoffs, or there's too much cross collaboration that needs to happen. And most organizations don't have great practices around cross-functional teaming and cross-functional decision rights and that sort of thing. So those are the most common ones that I think I see leaders reaching for the reorg lever. And again, I think there's probably a part of the structure is almost always part of the answer, but it's very rarely the only answer, especially if it's a major reorg where we're talking about like the entire organization. There's just so much churn that comes out of that. And what we would say is like, all right, well, maybe you're right. Maybe there is some structural stuff going on here that we should explore. How can we test and learn our way into whatever your hypotheses are around structure? Let's not kind of just blow up the whole organization because you think it's going to be the right move. But what are the principles that we're actually using or want to test around structure? And can we do that in one part of the organization? Or can we create like a temporary structure that will tell us whether or not our hypotheses around what good structure looks like and enables for us, whether we can actually gather some data around that. And then, based on how that goes, then you potentially can go further with it or pivot from there. But at least you're learning in a smaller blast zone as opposed to the entire organization or an entire department being that blast zone.
You mentioned that, it's any sort of tension that kind of drives these senior leaders into that sort of mode where they have to reorg it. And then you kind of think that, I think part of the reason why you went into the DAO thing itself, maybe I'm wrong, but a feeling is that when you are at the top, as a senior leader, I mean, it is very imperative that you're able to sense what's going on within your people to be able to take such radical calls in the first place, right? But from your experiences, talking to these senior leaders, this is the complete opposite. They have no clue of what's really causing these tensions within the broader aspect itself. The inability to kind of talk it out with your people, the inability to kind of test it out and bring that sort of processes with which you guys are pretty good at, you see all that radical shifts, where, okay, they go for that reorg and all of that. So is that a problem of too much authority at the top without a lot of communication? Or is that an authority problem, or is that a communication issue?
I mean, I'll give you the very consultant answer, which is it's both. But no, you're right. I think the biggest, well, that's maybe too big of a statement. One of the biggest challenges that traditional organizations have is that basically the role of sensing what is happening in the organization is primarily restricted to the very top of the organization, because it's not to say that people lower in the hierarchy don't have a feel of like what is going on. They absolutely do. But in the most hierarchical organizations, they have nothing to do with that information. So they kind of just stop noticing it, and they're, focused on their specific role and what they can kind of influence in their various areas. But they're no longer kind of a general purpose sensor of what is happening in the organization. And I think the huge opportunity for DAOs and for self-managing traditional organizations, which I forgot to mention, the Ready itself is a self-managing organization, and we have been from the very beginning. So 40 plus people, no bosses, self-set compensation, kind of dynamically teaming around the work that we do. We're the first, we really take seriously eating our own dog food around kind of talking about progressive organizations. But the opportunity for, like I said, for DAOs, for self-managing organizations, is how do you make every person who is part of that organization a useful sensor that is telling us what is going on in the organization? So I think this is an idea that comes from holacracy, but I think it's a really powerful metaphor. As a sensor in the organization, you're gathering data about like what's happening internally, what's happening in the external market, and do you have a venue or a channel for that information to influence larger things? And there's just such potential for when everybody in an organization is being used or is able to engage as a sensor and provide useful information that we can use as an organization, rather than only the very top is a sensor and everybody else is just kind of there. I think you just miss out on so much of the potential understanding and sense making that's happening internally and externally. So I think that's what if DAOs become truly kind of a massive phenomena in the general public, that is part of their advantage. Like, how do you, that potential energy that exists in an organization, if DAOs can figure out how to channel that into productive kinetic energy, they're unstoppable. But that's hard. And it's much easier to just say that than it is to like actually have the practices and the structures and the tools to actually make that happen.
I think a lot of the whole, in theory, DAOs were supposed to be this whole network of people / nodes, where they all had the authority to just kind of be able to take ownership, take decisions, and be responsible for the broader direction in which the whole community is going, rather than the example that you mentioned of the senior leader taking that broad call of the reorg itself. But you see, take a look at DAOs in general today. Even now, as you mentioned, it's not that easy. Even now, decisions are taken by very few people within the ecosystem. Voting itself has a massive apathy. And the most important thing, is that as a broader collective, there is not a lot of communication that goes on, I mean, the best example was, I think, Blue DAO. That's the DAO with women, focused on women and non-binary onboarding, and the whole issue about what happened with the whole, is there some sort of financial issues or something like that. I mean, all of that was just undercurrents that was going on within the DAO until it brutally exploded, we are starting to see that whole what is kind of a replication of what's going on with the triad world in the DAO system itself. So you tend to feel that, all right, you as a structure, DAOs have it. You have the ability to pass on ownership. You have the ability for these DAOs in general to create that sort of framework where everybody is able to take a decision, can communicate, and be more empowered than what goes on with these triad organizations. what is the ingredient? I mean, what is that ingredient that's kind of stopping DAOs here? I mean, do we need that sort of? I mean, what was critical with you mentioned about action meetings and all of that is you were able to facilitate that sort of communication in a very focused way. Is it the lack of structure of that that's missing within DAOs, or are there like broader issues that you see?
Yeah, you kind of landed right where I think I was going to go, which is great. Which is I think I have even seen in my roughly a year or so of being involved in DAOs a greater appreciation for this. But I think there is a misconception that emergence will just happen naturally. Like we put a lot of faith in this idea of emergence, and I think a lot of times when I see people talking about emergence, like on Twitter or whatever, I kind of see them just kind of like waving their hands around as they're saying it. You know, like emergence, we trust in emergence, and emergence in the kind of complex adaptive system sense of the word requires structure to emerge. There has to be rules. There has to be, like I said, structure to hang off of. That's how you get meaningful emergence. So I'm always a voice of smart, kind of minimum viable structure in self-managing organizations. And whether that's, you know, we know that we run a thing called an action meeting that has these 5 steps that we, you know, eventually don't even need facilitation on because we know how to do it. Or there's, you know, hundreds of different examples of structure. Once you have structure, people will understand and learn how to play within that structure. And then that's where you start to get that useful emergence that I think a lot of DAOs are looking for. If you have no structure at all, people don't know how to show up. They don't know where to put various ideas. They don't know whether this is welcome here or over here. And that's the tyranny of structurelessness. That's the chaos that I think a lot of DAOs, maybe some DAOs, are just kind of hoping like eventually you go through enough of that and then the good stuff kind of like bubbles to the surface. And maybe you get lucky and maybe some of that does happen. But I think it would be a mistake to conflate meaningful kind of minimum viable structure with like turning DAOs into traditional organizations. Like there are that's what I'm not saying is like we bring over structure from traditional organizations. What I am saying is we figure out what structure looks like for DAOs and embrace that. You know, could be things as simple as what are the roles that we have within this organization? Do we know who is filling them and what the criteria are to potentially fill and what we can expect from these roles and what kind of what avenues do we have for removing someone from a role if they're not actually fulfilling what we all agreed that we need the role to do? Like getting clarity on those sorts of things allows us to not have to worry about some of those like kind of background processes and frees up our cognition and our attention to like do the work of the DAO, whatever it ends up being.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this series. We will now head into part 2 where we talk about how tools like Discord and other tools also facilitate this sort of emergence and team cohesion. And we also talk about how the Ready as a self-organized community functions. It has given that sort of insights that's kind of useful for DAOs to kind of utilize. We also get into the broad tensions that DAOs in general kind of face and how having that sort of organizational canvas assessment allows for a broad rethinking of whatever is creating the tensions and sorting it out. What an organizational canvas is all about as well. There are many broad conversations inside also that we want to keep it without any spoilers, so do stay tuned for that one. Have a happy listening. Have a great day ahead.